パウジパウジパウジ来てるカウパカウパパウジル王子チャチャチャチャチャラチャチャチャチャチャチャラチャブルトラチャチャチャチャチャラチャブルトラチャチャチャチャチャラチャ緊急号外 FRB パウエル議長のパウジースピーチ翻訳ということで SP500 が3700ドル台ビットコイン17000台17000ドル台ブレイクアウト寸止め劇場ということでお疲れちゃーんみんな息してるということで皆さん息してますか？私はシーフード食べてきましたね。シーフードまあこれは41ドル USD で41ドルだったんだけどね。まあホタテとかさシュリンプとかさサーモンがあったからまあそれで41ドルはまあしょうがないかなとは思うけどね。ということですでに 0.75% 利上げ発表これはさっきしましたよね。はいということで注目なのがパウジル発射するかどうかですね。はいパウジリ祭りパーシー法言っちゃってるまあ言っちゃってるのかどうなのかまだわかんねえのね。ゴリはまだパウジルのねスピーチ聞いてないからこれからだけどね皆さん知ってるかもしれないけどブルートラを右から左へ受け流す現物積み立てするだけやが暇投資って暇なのよ。そんなにねそんな買い場ってこないのよ。ということでビットコインのねスピーチ前のおさらいですけどもまあちょっとね17000ドルに行くかというところのね直前まあこれもね前回のここと一緒でまあ騙しのフェイクアウトの可能性は全然なくないんだよね。だトリプルボトムみたいな感じでやってボトムじゃなくて突き抜けるのか今回突き抜けるのか分かんないけどね。だから明日だよね。明日多分勢いってかまあ方向性がね明らかになると思うんだよね。こっからこうやってね下にね行くのかまた反発してねブルトラをねまたベアトラップからのまたブルトラでこうなるのかわかんないけどね。だからでもねまあタイミング的にはずーっと言ってるけどねクジランが来るとしたらね FOMC の後だよねっていうところだから直近ではだよ。でまあボリンジャーバンド的にもさむしろここは良かったのよ。一回上に突き抜けたからねブルトラからの下げっていうのがね気持ちよくできててむしろ良かったのよ。なんだけどもまあこれ見るとさほんと綺麗なねブルトラなのよ。これドンピシャすぎるのよね。まずねボリンジャーバンドのアパーバンド突き抜けるでしょ。これってゴリが予想的中させたパターンでしょ。でしかも200日にムービングアベレッジはここにあるわけよね。だからここがちょうどねブルトラのねまあレジスタンスポイントっていうのかな。でそっから真逆のローアーバウンドまで行くっていうね。これ上げた後水かけて突き抜けるみたいなね。でこれがただのリトレースメントのプルバックでまたこうやって落ちてくっていうのであれば全然いいんだけどね。まあその可能性がどれぐらいあるか正直わかんないけども、ただまあブルトラの形としてはねすんごいいい騙し上げだったかなとは個人的に思うんだよね。結果的にはね結果論で言うと、ここまで突き上げて下げるっていうね、完全なるフェイクアウトパターンやな。ただこれがねやっぱりデイリーチャートで見る限りではだよねまだ突き抜けてないんだよね。だからまあここ突き抜ける明確なところ来てるのよ。ここなのよ。もう5回目だっけタッチしてんの。そうやな5回目だよね。だからそろそろね落ちていいはずなんだよね。で落ちるとしたら明日明後日か来週からの月曜日からわかんないけどね。ということでまあこれがってかどうなるかだけどもまあどっちにしてもねまずパウジル王子のね発射状況をね確認したいなと思うのでまずはスピーチをね見てねなんか噂ではあんまり何もね新しい情報言ってなかったって感じだけどね息してるでよかったはいよかったということでスマッチョ熱望ねはいというこ で皆さん、準備はいいですか？パウジル王子、いかにということで、パウジルのスピーチ翻訳をしていきたいと思います。皆さん、おむつを履いてくださいね。ていうかまあこれね、もうすでに、8時間以上前だっけ ?10 時間以上前だな。そうだな。11時間ぐらい前にもうスピーチ出てるから、もうニュースはたくさん出てると思うんだよね、このスピーチの内容。ということで、ジェットラグスマッシュゴリはジェットラグないけどね。ぶっちゃけ。ということで、スマッシュをしてからですね、今92名見てるからね。半分の45まで。スマッシュしてからお願いします。ということで、準備はいいか？おむつは履いたかお前ら。ということで、始めます。パウジー、いっちゃってる。
Good afternoon. My colleagues and I are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down, and we're moving expeditiously to do so. We have both the tools we need and the resolve it will take to restore price stability on behalf of American families and businesses. The economy and the country have been through a lot over the past 2.5 years and have proved resilient. It is essential that we bring inflation down to our 2% goal if we are to have a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. From the standpoint of our congressional mandate to promote maximum employment and price stability, the current picture is plain to see. The labor market is extremely tight, and inflation is much too high.
レイバーマーケットはタイト。タイトというのは強いっていう意味だと思うんだよね。ただインフレはちょっと高すぎるってね。too high 高すぎる。
Against this backdrop, today the FOMC raised its policy interest rate by 3/4 of a percentage point and anticipates that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. And I'll have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments.
さらに、国際バランスシートのリダクションもね、このペースでやっていきますって感じですね。利上げを 0.75 にしてね。
Recent indicators of spending and production have softened. Growth in consumer spending has slowed significantly, in part reflecting lower real disposable income and tighter financial conditions.
ということで、直近では、使えるね、所得が減ってると、ディスポーザブルインカムが減ってると、つまり、手取りで残ってる量が減ってると、
Activity in the housing sector has weakened, in part reflecting higher mortgage rates. And after a strong increase in the first quarter, business fixed investment also looks to have declined in the second quarter. Despite these developments, the labor market has remained extremely tight, with the unemployment rate near a 50-year low, job vacancies near historical highs, and wage growth elevated. Over the past 3 months, employment rose by an average of 375,000 jobs per month, down from the average pace seen earlier in the year, but still robust. Improvements in labor market conditions have been widespread, including for workers at the lower end of the wage distribution, as well as for African Americans and Hispanics. Labor demand is very strong. まあ、マイノリティのね、ヒスパニックとかブラックのね、レイバーパーティシペーションが向上してるって言ってるよ。 While labor supply remains subdued, with the labor force participation rate little changed since January. Overall, the continued strength of the labor market suggests that underlying aggregate demand remains solid. Inflation remains well above our longer-run goal of 2%. Over the 12 months ending in May, total PCE prices rose 6.3%, excluding the volatile food and energy categories. Core PCE prices rose 4.7%. In June, the 12-month change in the consumer price index came in above expectations at 9.1%, and the change in the core CPI was 5.9%. Notwithstanding the recent slowdown in overall economic activity, aggregate demand appears to remain strong. Supply constraints have been larger and longer lasting than anticipated, and price pressures are evident across a broad range of goods and services. Although prices for some commodities have turned down recently, the earlier surge in prices of crude oil and other commodities that resulted from Russia's war on Ukraine has boosted prices for gasoline and food, creating additional upward pressure on inflation. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship, especially on those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we're strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by 3/4 of a percentage point, bringing the target range to 2.25% to 2.5%. And we're continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet, which plays an important role in firming the stance of monetary policy. Over coming months, we will be looking for compelling evidence that inflation is moving down, consistent with inflation returning to 2%. We anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate. The pace of those increases will continue to depend on the incoming data and evolving outlook for the economy. Today's increase in the target range is the second 75 basis point increase in as many meetings. While another unusually large increase could be appropriate at our next meeting, that is a decision that will depend on the data we get between now and then. We will continue to make our decisions in as many meetings. While another unusually large increase could be appropriate at our next meeting.
言っちゃってる。パウジーなんて言ったか言いますか？ While another unusually large increase could be appropriate ということで、unusually large increase つまり 0.75% から 1% の夢の待望の 1% 利上げがね、最適である可能性がね、最適な状況はありかねない、つまり可能性があると、つまり 0.75% を11月1日のね2日にやる、もしくは 1% の利上げ来てもおかしくないよと、状況次第でばと言っちゃってる。これは夢がある。 おむつ2枚履いた。会長の記者たちもおむつは履いたのか。会長の記者たちはおむつは履いてねえぜ。ドル円が最高値更新してるスマチョー。
That is a decision that will depend on the data we get between now and then. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting and communicate our thinking as clearly as possible. As the stance of monetary policy tightens further, it likely will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases while we assess how our cumulative policy adjustments are affecting the economy and inflation. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring demand into better balance with supply in order to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Making appropriate monetary policy in this uncertain environment requires a recognition that the economy often evolves in unexpected ways. Inflation has obviously surprised to the upside over the past year, and further surprises could be in store. We therefore will need to be nimble in responding to incoming data and the evolving outlook. And we will strive to avoid adding uncertainty in what is already an extraordinarily challenging and uncertain time. We are highly attentive to inflation risks and determined to take the measures necessary to return inflation to our 2% longer-run goal. This process is likely to involve a period of below-trend economic growth and some softening in labor market conditions. But such outcomes are likely necessary to restore price stability and determined to take the measures necessary to return inflation to our 2% longer-run goal. This process is likely to involve a period of below-trend economic growth.
ということで、インフレを 2% に下げるためには、ね、で利上げをね、しないといけないと。その結果、below trend economic growth ということで、below trend。つまり平均以下の経済成長ということで、経済がね、インパクトを受けますよっていうことを言ってるんですよ。
This process is likely to involve a period of below trend economic growth.
Below trend economic growth ということで、経済的成長がね、平均を下回る。スピードが遅くなるよと。
And some softening in labor market conditions.
Some softening labor market conditioning.
Such outcomes are
Some softening in labor market conditions ということで、レイバーマーケット、労働市場がソフトになると、つまり失業率が上がるということは、不可避ですよと。もちろんこれは本当必要、しょうがないんだけどね。利上げをすることで、会社がね、厳しくなって、失業率が多少上がると。それはもう避けられないということを言ってる。
are likely necessary to restore price stability and to set the stage.
だから失業率が多少上がること、経済成長 GDP が減ることっていうのは必要であると。インフレを 2% 下げるには。
For achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thanks for taking our questions. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Wondering if you can walk us through your thinking around the decision not to go for a full percentage point increase. We saw a ramp up after the May CPI report.
パウジル、なんで今回 1% 利上げしなかったのっていうのを教えてって言ってるよ。なんで 0.75 で 1% じゃないの
came in hotter than usual, and obviously the June figure did too. Was there any discussion of a stronger hike at this meeting? Thank you.
Sure. So we did judge that a 75 basis point increase was the right magnitude in light of the data in the context of the ongoing increases in the policy rate that we've been making. I'd say that we wouldn't hesitate to make an even larger move than we did today if the committee were to conclude.
いいちょっとパウジル法パウジル発射ということで、今回は周辺のデータを見た限りでは 0.75 が適切だと思うけれども、これがね悪くなったらさらに上がった FF レートの利上げはアプロピレートでつまり不適切ではないと、つまり問題ないということで、
5 basis point increase was the right magnitude in light of the data in the context of the ongoing increases in the policy rate that we've been making. I'd say that we wouldn't hesitate to make an even larger move.
We wouldn't hesitate to なので躊躇しないと。何を躊躇しないかといって 1% の利上げも状況次第では躊躇しませんよと言ってるんですよ。
Than we did today if the committee were to conclude that was.
To make an even larger move なので 0.75 よりも高い利上げをねすることは躊躇しませんと。
That were appropriate. That was not the case at this meeting. There was very
ただ今回では違うと。
broad support for the move that we made. You mentioned the June meeting. We had said many times that we were prepared to move more aggressively if inflation continued to disappoint. And that's why we did move to a more aggressive pace at the June meeting, as we said we would do. At this meeting, we continued at that more aggressive pace as inflation has continued to disappoint in the form of the June CPI reading.
Thank you so much for taking our questions. Colby Smith with the Financial Times. As the committee considers the policy path forward, how will it weigh the expected decline in headline inflation, which might come as a result of the drop in commodity prices, against the fact that we are likely to see some persistence in core readings in particular? And given that potential tension and signs of any kind of activity weakening here, how has the committee's thinking changed on how far into restrictive territory rates might need to go?
So, I guess I'd start by saying we've been saying we would move expeditiously to get to the range of neutral, and I think we've done that now. We're at 225 to 2.5, and that's right in the range of what we think is neutral. So the question is, how are we thinking about the path forward? So one thing that hasn't changed is that it won't change. Is that our focus is going to continue to be on using our tools to bring demand back into better balance with supply in order to bring inflation back down. That'll continue to be our overarching focus. We also said that we expect ongoing rate hikes will be appropriate, and that we'll make decisions meeting by meeting. So what are we going to be looking at? We'll be looking at the incoming data, as I mentioned, and that'll start with economic activity. Are we seeing the slowdown in economic activity that we think we need? And there's some evidence that we are at this time. Of course, we'll be looking at labor market conditions, and we'll be asking whether we see of the alignment between supply and demand getting better, getting closer. Of course, we'll be looking closely at inflation. You mentioned headline and core. Our mandate is for headline. Of course, it's not for core, but we look at core because core is actually a better indicator of headline and of all inflation going forward. So we'll be looking at both, and we'll be looking at them for those both really for what they're saying about the outlook rather than just simply for what they say. But we'll be asking, do we see inflationary pressures declining? Do we see actual readings of inflation coming down? So in light of all that data, the question we'll be asking is whether the stance of policy we have is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation back down to our 2% target. And it's also worth noting that these rate hikes have been
CPI とヘッドライン CPI 両方見ますよと。コア CPI というのは燃料とね、食料系を抜いたやつがコア。ヘッドラインっていうのは全部合わせたやつ。で、今回ヘッドラインの CPI が 8.3%。コア CPI が 6.3% ぐらいだったんでね。で、これ落ちてないっていうことを言ってるんだよね。なので、2% のターゲットにインフレ率を持ってくるために、さらにリストリクティブ、つまり QT、ミキティのね、コンティティブタイトニング、つまり量的引き締めをやると。
large and they've come quickly, and it's likely that their full effect has not been felt by the economy. So there's probably some additional tightening.
しかも今までやってきた利上げなんだけども、ボディーブローのようにね、後々じわじわ効いてくるんだけども、それがまだね、完全に影響が出てないと。つまり時間差があるからね、今のところの利上げをして、それをね、しばらくキープしてないと、ボディーブローだから効いてこないから。薬飲んですぐ効かないでしょ。薬飲んで消化され始めて大体20分から30分ぐらいしてから効いてくると。一緒やな。利上げもそうなのよ。だから時間がかかると。
Significant additional tightening in the pipeline. So where are we going with this? I think the committee broadly feels that we need to get policy to at least to a moderately restrictive level. And maybe the best data point for that would be what we wrote down in our SEP at the June meeting. So I think the median for the end of this year, the median would have been between 3.25 and 3.5. And then people wrote down 50 basis points higher than that for 2023. So that's, even though that's now 6 weeks old, I guess, that's the most recent reading. Of course, we'll update that reading at the September meeting in 8 weeks. So that's how we're thinking about it. As I mentioned, as it relates to September, I said that another unusually large increase could be appropriate, but that's not a decision we're making now. It's one we'll make based on the data we see. And we're going to be making decisions meeting by meeting. We think it's time to just go to a meeting by meeting basis and not provide the kind of clear guidance that we had provided on the way to neutral.
Nick Timmeros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, you've said that your policy works through influencing expectations and that policy needs to be at least moderately restrictive, which means you need financial conditions to stay.
おい。この人前回もいたよね。この人ボタン開けすぎで全く同じシャツ着てる。前回と同じや。でさ、これさ、開けすぎだよなって前回言ったけど、この人ぶっちゃけどうなの？ベージュのさ、シャツをインナーで着てるわけなのかねこれ。わかんないけど。なんで全く同じファッションなのこれ。この人毎回同じファッションで FOMC 臨むのかね。これさ、ほぼ肌の色と同じだからさ、首と。間違えるよね、一瞬。この人前もいたよね。言っちゃってる。
Futures market pricing currently implies you will raise rates this year along the lines of your June SEP, but then lower them a few months.
いや、これデジャブかと思うぐらいさ、前回と同じすぎてさ、これってインナー着てんのかね。前回もだってこれダメだよねって言ったよね。買うパウエル議長やっちゃってー。
Later next year. Are these expectations consistent
質問型に入ってこない。
with the need to keep financial conditions tight in order to moderate purchasing power and bring inflation back to 2%?
So I'm going to start by pointing out that it's very hard to say with any confidence in normal times, what the economy is going to be doing in 6 or 12 months. And to try to predict what the appropriate monetary policy would respond to, I mean, of course, we do that in the SEP, but nonetheless, you've got to take any estimates of what rates will be next year with a grain of salt because there's so much uncertainty. These are not normal times. There's significantly more uncertainty now about the path ahead than I think there ordinarily is, and ordinarily it's quite high. So again, I would the only data point I have for you really is the June SEP, which I think is just the most recent thing that the committee's done. Since then, inflation has come in higher, economic activity has come in weaker than expected. But at the same time, I would say that's probably the best estimate of where the committee's thinking is still, which is that we would get to a moderately restrictive level by the end of this year, by which I mean somewhere between 3 and 3.5%, and that the committee sees further rate increases in 2023. As I mentioned, we'll update that, of course, at the September meeting, but that's really the best I can do on that.
You said inflation had been a little bit higher than anticipated. Has your view of the terminal rate changed since June?
So I wouldn't say I think we didn't expect a good reading, but this one was even worse than expected, I would say. I don't talk about my own personal estimate of what.
ということで、9月の CPI データは、パウジルが予想したよりも悪かったということです。まあ、それはそうだわな。実際、コアインフレーション 6.3% でさ、前回の 5.9 から上がっちゃってるからね。だから、8.5 のヘッドラインインフレーションが 8.3 には落ちたけども、コアはね、上がってるから、これパウジル王子のね、予想を上回ってて良くない、悪いってことなんだよ。だから、ターミナルレートっていうのは、おそらく、その利上げが止まるところのレートだと思うんだよね。どこまで利上げをね、するのかっていうところだと思うんだけども、何%ですかって聞いてるんだけど、それに対して、 CPI ね、予想より悪かったから、これ多分ターミナルレートも上がるよねっていう話をするんだと思うんだよね。
The terminal rate would be. I will write down that it's going to evolve. Obviously, it has evolved over the course. I think for all participants, it has evolved over the course of the year as we learn how persistent inflation is going to be. And by the time of the September meeting, we will have seen 2 more CPI readings and 2 more labor market readings, and significant amount of readings about economic activity and perhaps geopolitical developments. Who knows? It'll be a lot. It's an 8-week intervening period, so I think we'll see quite a lot of data, and we'll make our decision at that meeting based on that data.
Hi, Jarrell. Thanks for taking our question. Gina's from the New York Times. You kind of alluded to this earlier, but I wonder, in the
おい、おい、おいおいおい、お前このアングルダメだろ。これインナー着てるのか。着てないように見えるんだけど、どっちなのこれ。これ前回と全く同じアングルじゃん。これ。あ。おい。なぜだ。俺7月27日だぞ。言っちゃってる。おい。デジャブだと思ったら本当にデジャブじゃねえか。おいおいおい。パウジルー。やってくれたな。すいません。古かった。パウジルー。
with implementing monetary policies that promote maximum employment and
Total PCE prices rose 6.3%, excluding the vol.
お、今回はあのメスゴリラはファッション変わってるぜ。ほら、この人だよ、この人黒のスーツ着ちゃってるよ。やっちまった申し訳ない服違うわ。
Good afternoon. My colleagues and I are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. We have both the tools we need and the resolve that it will take to restore
パウジル仕切り直しや仕切り直しもう一発
price stability on behalf of American families and businesses. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and serves as the bedrock of our economy. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. Today, the FOMC raised its policy interest rate by 3/4 of a percentage point, and we anticipate that ongoing increases will be appropriate. We are moving our policy stance purposefully to a level that will be sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2%. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. I will have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments.
今のところね、これ7月の FOMC と全く同じこと言ってるよね。0.75% 利上げしました。で、これからもね、こういうペースでやってきます。で、国債シートの縮小も結構ハイペースでやってますよ。これ7月全く同じスピーチを今のところはね。
The U.S. economy has slowed from the historically high growth rates of 2021, which reflected the reopening of the economy following the pandemic recession. Recent indicators point to modest growth of spending and production. Growth in consumer spending has slowed from last year's rapid pace, in part reflecting lower real disposable income and tighter financial conditions. Activity in the housing sector has weakened significantly, in large part reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment, while weaker economic growth abroad.
住宅マーケットセクターは弱くなってると。まあこれはね、住宅ローンのイールドが上がってるから。
Is restraining exports. As shown in our summary of economic projections, since June, FOMC participants have marked down their projections for economic activity.
Whoa, changing real GDP was minus 前回。ということで、これ予想が2022年の予想が GDP がなんとちょうど 0.3% ぐらい。ギリギリゼロより上だけど、リセッションが年末まで続けばマイナスの
With the median projection for real GDP growth standing at just 0.2% this year and 1.2% next year, well below.
出ましたね、今。今年の GDP の予想が 0.2% かな ?0.4 かなで、来年が 1.2% かいったら今。うん。
The median estimate of the longer run normal growth rate. Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market has remained extremely tight, with the unemployment rate near a 50-year low, job vacancies near historical highs, and wage growth elevated. Job gains have been robust, with employment rising by an average of 378,000 jobs per month over the last 3 months. The labor market continues to be out of balance, with demand for workers substantially exceeding the supply of available workers. The labor force participation rate showed a welcome uptick in August, but has little changed since the beginning of the year. FOMC participants expect supply and demand conditions in the labor market to come into better balance over time, easing the upward pressure on wages and prices. The median projection in the SEP for the unemployment rate rises to 4.4% at the end of next year, a half percentage point higher than in the June projections. Over the next 3 years, the median unemployment rate runs above the median estimate of its longer-run normal level. Inflation remains well above our 2% longer-run goal. Participants expect supply and demand conditions than in the June projections.
これは失業率の予想ですけれども、2022年が 3.9% ぐらいで、2023年が 失業率が 4.5% ぐらいまで上がるって予想してるね。これは大事や。これはちょっとツイートするからスクショしとこう。ね。パウ G の今の予測では、失業率が年末で 3.9、来年が 4.5 まで上がるという可能性があると。そして GDP の予想があれだよね、これだよね。0.2% ぐらい、年末。で、来年が 1.2 ぐらい。パウジル。
Labor force participation rate showed a welcome uptick in August, but has little changed since the beginning of the year. FOMC participants expect supply and demand conditions in the labor market to come into better balance over time, easing the upward pressure on wages and prices. The median projection in the SP for the unemployment rate rises to 4.4% at the end of next year, a half percentage point higher than in the June projections.
4.4% なの 4.4% はね、来年失業率マックスで 4.4% まで上がると。で、2024年もだけど 4.4 ぐらいなのよ。だから、23年、24年は失業率が上がるピーク、つまりそこがちょうどね、SP500 とか一番暴落するところなのかななんてね、予想はしてますよ。これも前やったよね、SP500 と、失業率のね、相関関係で失業率が上がると大暴落に行くから、それが多分2023年と2024年じゃないのかなっていうね、この失業率のピークの予想とね、ドンピシャで当たればね。はい。
Over the next 3 years, the median unemployment rate runs above the median estimate of its longer run normal level. Inflation remains well above our 2% longer run goal. Over the 12 months ending in July, total PCE prices rose 6.3%. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 4.6%. In August, the 12-month change in the consumer price index was 8.3%, and the change in the core CPI was 6.3%. Price pressures remain evident across a broad range of goods and services. Although gasoline prices have turned down in recent months, they remain well above year-earlier levels, in part reflecting Russia's war against Ukraine, which has boosted prices for energy and food and has created additional upward pressure on inflation. The median projection in the S&P for total PCE inflation is 5.4% this year and falls to 2.8% next year, 2.3% in 2024, and 2% in 2025. Participants continue to see risks to inflation as weighted to the upside. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well-anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. But that is not grounds for complacency. The longer the current bout of high inflation continues, the greater the chance that expectations of higher inflation will become entrenched. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials, like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by 0.75 percentage point, bringing the target range to 3 to 3.25%. And we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet, which closes our 2% objective. And I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials, like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by 0.75 percentage point, bringing the target range to 3 to 3.25%. And we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet, which plays an important role in firming the stance of monetary policy. Over coming months, we will be looking for compelling evidence that inflation is moving down, consistent with inflation returning to 2%. We anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate. The pace of those increases will continue to depend on the incoming data and the evolving outlook for the economy. With today's action, we have raised interest rates by 3 percentage points this year. At some point, as the stance of monetary policy tightens further, it will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases while we assess how our cumulative policy adjustments are affecting the economy and inflation. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting and communicate our thinking as clearly as possible. Restoring price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive policy stance for some time. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. As shown in the S&P, the median projection for the appropriate level of the federal funds rate is 4.4% at the end of this year, 1 percentage point higher than projected in June. The median projection rises to 4.6% at the end of next year and declines to 2.9% by the end of 2025, still above the median estimate of its longer run value. Of course, these projections do not represent a committee decision or plan, and no one knows with any certainty where the economy will be a year or more.
パウジル発射 Assessment about appropriate monetary policy ということで FF レート年末には 4.4% の可能性ですね。つまり今の FF レートがちょうどこれじゃないね。これは CPI だからな。今の FF レートが 3.75 なわけよ。ね。3.75。これが 4.4% くらいまで上がるということで、あと 0.75 利上げをすると。だから多分11月が何もなかったら 0.5 に下がって、12月が 0.25 みたいなね。で 0.75 プラスすると 3.7 プラス 0.7 から 4.4 ぐらい。で年末を終えると。そして2023年、さらに利上げもね、4月5月ぐらいまでやるから 0.25、0.25 みたいなね。だから 0.4 から 0.65、0.8 みたいなね。ちょうど 5% の手前 4.9 ぐらいまで2023年ね、ピークの利上げ。で、利下げが始まるのが2023年夏以降だと思うんだよね。状況によっては。で、2024年ですら、利下げはするんだけども 0.25、0.25 でゆっくり利下げしてくるから、それでも FF レートは 4% とかっていうね。 感じで、23年、24年はずーっとね、利率が高いところにいるわけだから、これはね、米株とかね、がっつり来るよね。ということで、ね、FF レート年末はね、3.25 とかっていう風なのが、ね、前までずっと出てたけど違うね、もう。今年はもう 4.4 とかね、1% ね、情報修正だよね、FF レート。状況が悪いから。後ろの国旗パウジェルついて黄ばんでんぞ。今日のパウジーかっけー。つつもたせっぽい。11月の FOMC で 0.5% 対して中間選挙対策。どうだろうね。
From now. We are taking forceful and rapid steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a sustained period of below-trend growth, and there will very likely be some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. We will keep at it until we're confident the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thank you for taking our question. Gina Smiley from the New York Times. I wonder if you could give us a little detail around.
この人、目線一応取る。今回服は違う。今回は前回の失敗なのか分かんないけども、改めて服を変えてきた。ダーク系に変えてきた。
How you'll know when to slow down these rate increases and how you'll eventually know when to stop.
So I will answer your question directly, but I want to start here today by saying that my main message has not changed at all since Jackson Hole. The FOMC is strongly resolved to bring inflation down to 2%, and we will keep at it until the job is done. So the way we're thinking about this is the overarching focus of the committee is getting inflation back down to 2%. To accomplish that, we think we'll need to do two things in particular to achieve a period of growth below trend and also some softening in labor market conditions to foster a better balance between demand and supply in the labor market. So on the first, committee's forecasts and those of most outside forecasters do show growth running below its longer run potential this year and next year. On the second, though, so far there's only modest evidence that the labor market is cooling off. Job openings are down a bit. As you know, quits are off their all-time highs. There's some signs that some wage measures may be flattening out but not moving up. Payroll gains have moderated but not much. And in light of the high inflation we're seeing, we think we'll need to, and in light of what I just said, we think that we'll need to bring our funds rate to a restrictive level and to keep it there for some time. So what we'll be looking at, I guess, is your question. So we'll be looking at a few things. First, we'll want to see growth continuing to run below trend. We'll want to see movements in the labor market showing a return to a better balance between supply and demand. And ultimately, we'll want to see clear evidence that inflation is moving back down to 2%. So that's what we'll be looking for. In terms of reducing rates, I think we want to be very confident that inflation is moving back down to 2% before we would consider that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Steve Leisman, CNBC. Can you talk about how you factor in the variable lags on inflation and the extent to which the outlook for rates should be seen as linear in the sense that you keep raising rates, or can you envision a time when there's a pause to kind of look at what has been wrought in the economy from the rate increases? Thank you.
Sure. So, of course, monetary policy does famously work with long variable lags. The way I think of it is our policy decisions affect financial conditions immediately. In fact, financial conditions have usually been affected well before we actually announce our decisions. Then changes in financial conditions begin to affect economic activity fairly quickly within a few months. But it's likely to take some time to see the full effects of changing financial conditions on inflation. So we are very much mindful for that. And that's why I noted in my opening remarks that at some point, as the stance of policy tightens further, it will become appropriate to slow the pace of rate hikes while we assess how our cumulative policy adjustments are affecting the economy and inflation. So that's how we think about that. Your second question, sorry, was?
Is there a point in time you can see pausing? Is it linear? You keep raising rates, or is there? Oh, sorry.
めっちゃカメラマン写真撮ってる。そんな使う写真。毎回同じパウジーやん。
I should know better than to not with my microphone.
I should know better than to answer your second question.
ゴリ戻ってきた。ネット接続再開。ということで。
So that's how we think about that. Your second question, sorry, was?
Is there a point in time you can see pausing? Is it linear? You keep raising rates, or is there? Oh, sorry.
Confident and stay there for a time. But we're not at that level. Clearly today, we've just moved, I think, probably into the very lowest level of what might be restrictive. And certainly in my view and the view of the committee, there's a ways to go.
Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thank you for taking our questions. The projections show
without as much of an increase in price stability while achieving a relatively modest decline, a rather increase in unemployment and a soft landing would be very challenging.
And where that destination is, how it's moving up if inflation doesn't perform as you expect. Do you want to have a policy rate that's above the underlying inflation rate, for example? And do you have an estimate for where you think the underlying inflation rate might be in the economy right now?
Well, so again, we believe that we need to raise our policy stance overall to a level that is restrictive. And by that I mean is putting meaningful downward pressure on inflation. That's what we need to see in the stance of policy. We also know that there are long variable lengths, particularly as they relate to inflation. So it's a challenging. I don't know what the odds are. I think that there's a very high likelihood that we'll have a period of what I mentioned is below trend growth, by which I mean much lower growth. And we're seeing that now. So the median forecast, I think, this year for among my colleagues and me was 0.2% growth. So that's very slow growth. And then below trend next year, I think the median was 1.2, also well below. So that's a slower, it's a very slow level of growth, and it could give rise to increases in unemployment. But I think that is something that we think we need to have, and we think we need to have softer labor market conditions as well. We're never going to say that there are too many people working, but the real point is this. Inflation, what we hear from people when we meet with them is that they really are suffering from inflation. And if we want to set ourselves up, really light the way to another period of a very strong labor market, we have got to get inflation behind us. I wish there were a painless way to do that. There isn't. So what we need to do is get rates up to the point where we're putting meaningful downward pressure on inflation. And that's what we're doing. And we certainly don't hope, we certainly haven't given up the idea that we can have a relatively modest increase in unemployment. Nonetheless, we need to complete this task.
How do you know if you got too far?
Hard to hypothetically deal with that question. I mean, our really tight focus now continues to be ongoing rate increases to get the policy rate up where it needs to be. And as I said, you can look at
Can you spell that out a little more for the general public and how that would work?
So for starters, people are seeing their wage increases, their wage increases eaten up by inflation. So if your family is one where you spend most of your paycheck, every paycheck cycle, on gas, food, transportation, clothing, basics of life, and prices go up the way they've been going up, you're in trouble right away. You don't have a cushion, and this is very painful for people at the lower end of the income and wealth spectrum. So that's what we're hearing from people is price stability just rises. And so we want to avoid that. We want to act aggressively now and get this job done and keep at it until it's done.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. Nicole Good, CNN Business. Existing home sales have fallen for 7 months straight. Mortgage rates are at their highest level since 2008. Yet mortgage demand increased this week, and housing prices are still elevated. Now, at the end of your June press conference, you mentioned plans to reset the housing market. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you mean when you say reset, and what you think it will take to actually get there.
So when I say reset, I'm not looking at a particular specific set of data or anything. What I'm really saying is that we've had a time of a red hot housing market all over the country where famously houses were selling to the first buyer at 10% above the ask before even seeing the house, that kind of thing. So there was a big imbalance between supply and demand. Housing prices were going up at an unsustainably fast level. So the deceleration in housing prices that we're seeing should help bring sort of prices more closely in line with rents and other housing market fundamentals. And that's a good thing. For the longer term, what we need is supply and demand to get better aligned so that housing prices go up at a reasonable level, at a reasonable pace, and that people can afford houses again. And I think we probably in the housing market have to go through a correction to get back to that place. There are also longer run issues though with the housing market, as you know, where it's
ということで、パウジェル発射終了。ビットコイン上がってるけども、SP500 は$3,700。前回の底である、ここ3,600まで GoTo 熱望。あと$100や。あと$100だぜ。これは更新熱望すぎる。ということで、アップル落ちてる。ブルトラだったってことね。グーグルも落ちてる。マイクロソフトも落ちてる。アマゾンも落ちてる。アマゾンそこに向かって GoTo って感じだよね、これは。いい夢見させてくれよ。インフレだけじゃなくてデフォルトとか事件が起こりそう。メタもいいな、これ落ちてるな、綺麗に。テスラもこんな感じでやってよ。ショッピファイ。テスラはね、強いけどね。ということで、ゴリ、予想通り 0.75% の利上げで FOMC では年末からね、来年の夏までの CPI と失業率のデータの予測があったので、それをね、物差しにして今後も見ていきたいなと思いますので、いや、パウジは早口だなじゃなくてさ、これ2倍速再生してるのよ。これ2倍速再生してからしなかったらこんなにゆっくり喋ってるの。
difficult to find lots now close enough to cities and things like that. So builders are having a hard time getting zoning and lots and workers.
はい、これだけゆっくり喋ってんだよ、実際は。ということで、ゴリまた意識が飛んでる。意識朦朧としてる中の YouTube ライブ、いっちゃってる。ということで、ゴリ、今日も疲れたので、ネマッチョですね。明日、そして来週と SP500 など、機関投資家が売ってくるか。こちらもあともう少しや。夢見させてくれ。ゴリはずっと待ってた。ということで、もう意識飛んでるんでね、いつノックダウンされるか分かんない。目が、ね、泳いでるので、今すでにね。寝たいと思います。はい。ということで、ゴリモーフィアス今日の動画、英語翻訳スピーチライブ、役立ったと思った方は、ガッテン、ゴリガッテンスマッチョ熱望。ということで、深夜にお会いしましょうか。バイバイ。